Chapter 1: A Distressing Summons and a Grisly Discovery. It was a Tuesday evening, precisely the sort of dreary, unremarkable Tuesday that London often bestows upon its inhabitants in late autumn. I had spent the better part of the day at my modest practice, attending to a rather obstinate case of ague and bandaging a boy's knee, activities that, whilst necessary, offered little in the way of mental stimulus. By 7 o'clock, my duties discharged, I found myself in the comfortable, if somewhat threadbare, armchair by my own fireplace, a copy of the Lancet lying unread upon my lap. The gaslight hissed softly, casting long shadows about the room, and the distant rumble of hansom cabs was the only intrusion upon the stillness. A cup of lukewarm tea sat beside me, its steam long vanished. My thoughts, as they often did in such quiet moments, drifted to Baker Street and the peculiar dynamic of my life spent alongside Sherlock Holmes. I considered his sharp intellect, his often irritating eccentricities, and the ceaseless labyrinth of crime that seemed to draw him in like a moth to a flame. Little did I know, as I contemplated the relative tranquillity of my separate existence, that a tempest was even then brewing, poised to engulf us both in a manner more personal and devastating than any case we had yet faced. The jarring ring of my doorbell shattered the quietude. It was late for a patient, and I confess to a momentary flicker of annoyance as I rose to answer it. Standing on my doorstep, rain glistening on his oilskin, was a young constable, his face pale and etched with an unusual urgency. "Dr. Watson," he stammered, his eyes wide. "There's been a grave incident, sir. Near the Thames Embankment. Inspector Lestrade requests your immediate presence, and Mr. Holmes's, if he be available." A grave incident. My pulse quickened. Such summons rarely portended good news. What nature of incident, constable? A murder, sir. And, well, it's Mr. Reginald Barlow. The shipping magnate. Reginald Barlow. The name struck me as vaguely familiar, a figure known more for his aggressive business dealings and frequent appearances in the society columns than for any particular virtue. He was, if memory served, a man of considerable wealth but dubious reputation, whose recent ventures had been whispered about in the city as bordering on the illicit. A murder, then, was perhaps not entirely unexpected for such a man, though regrettable all the same. "Very well," I said, snatching my coat and hat. "Lead the way." The cab ride was swift and silent, save for the rhythmic clopping of hooves on wet cobblestones. The constable offered no further details, merely a series of increasingly nervous glances in my direction. When we arrived, the scene was already bustling with the grim efficiency of the Metropolitan Police. A knot of onlookers, drawn by the flashing lanterns, huddled behind a police cordon, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine shock. Lestrade, a formidable figure even on the grimmest of nights, emerged from the throng, his expression unusually grim. "Watson, thank heavens." "And Holmes? Is he with you?" "He was not at home, Inspector. I was at my own residence when your constable called," I explained, stepping through the cordon into the lamplit circle around the victim. The sight was indeed grisly. Mr. Barlow lay sprawled amid some overgrown shrubbery, not far from the chilly embrace of the Thames. His usually florid face was now a ghastly pallor, a dark stain blossoming on his waistcoat. It was evident he had met a violent end. My medical eye quickly took in the scene, the unnatural angle of the head, the peculiar disarray of his clothing. As I surveyed the grim tableau, a memory, hazy and unwelcome, surfaced. I had indeed been in this very vicinity earlier that evening. After a late house call to a patient suffering from influenza in Wapping, I had taken a slightly longer, more circuitous route home, hoping to enjoy a brief, solitary constitutional along the embankment. I had been deep in thought, perhaps considering a particularly perplexing medical journal article, and had paid little mind to my surroundings, beyond the comforting glow of the riverside lamps. I recalled passing a small, secluded copse of trees, not unlike the one now illuminated by police lanterns, and hearing what might have been a muffled altercation, or perhaps just the drunken ramblings of a passer-by. I had dismissed it, a common enough sound in London's darker corners, and continued on my way. The exact time, however, was now a troubling blur. It was then that Lestrade, his voice lowered, drew me aside. His usual bluster was replaced by an uncomfortable hesitancy. "Watson," he began, "there's something quite disturbing. We have witnesses, several of them, who place a man matching your exact description, your height, build, even your specific medical bag, arguing heatedly with Barlow near this spot, not half an hour before the discovery." He paused, his gaze fixed on my face, searching. "One even claims to have heard your voice, sir." My blood ran cold. The muffled sounds, my vague recollections, my distinctive medical bag, it coalesced into a deeply unsettling pattern. "That's preposterous, Lestrade." I was returning from a patient, minding my own business. Lestrade nodded slowly, regret heavy in his eyes. "I know, Watson, I know. It flies in the face of all reason. But the descriptions are too precise. And then, there's this." He stooped and picked up a small, muddy object from the ground, holding it out to me. It was a small, ornate silver clasp, the kind often used to fasten a watch chain or a fob. My heart sank. I recognized it instantly. It was from the watch chain I had worn that very day, a small gift from my late wife, Mary. It must have slipped loose sometime during my walk. Just at that moment, the familiar, lean figure of Sherlock Holmes emerged from the shadows, his keen eyes already sweeping over the scene, absorbing every detail. He walked with his characteristic purposeful stride, his deerstalker casting a sharp silhouette against the lamplight. He had evidently just arrived, perhaps having been summoned directly to the scene, or having discerned the nature of the commotion from a distance. "Lestrade," Holmes greeted, his voice calm, "what fresh folly has London bestowed upon us tonight?" His gaze, however, settled on me, then on the clasp in Lestrade's hand, and finally, with a piercing intensity, on the body of Barlow. Lestrade, still holding the clasp, explained the situation, his words carefully chosen, though his discomfort was evident. "Mr. Holmes, a heinous crime. Mr. Reginald Barlow, deceased. And, regrettably, Dr. Watson has been placed at the scene, by several reliable witnesses, exhibiting, shall we say, a high degree of agitation." He hesitated, then, and this, sir, was found not 3 feet from the victim. He presented the clasp to Holmes. Holmes took the silver clasp, turning it over in his long, sensitive fingers. His eyes, usually alight with intellectual fire, clouded with a sudden, profound concern. He looked from the clasp to me, then back to the deceased, his brow furrowing deeper than I had ever seen it. There was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, a flicker of something akin to doubt in his usually unshakable demeanor. It was quickly banished, however, replaced by a grim determination. He knew me, knew my nature. He knew I was no murderer. And yet, the evidence, even in this nascent stage, was disturbingly precise. The air, already thick with the scent of damp earth and dread, seemed to press down upon us. This was not merely a case, this was a personal maelstrom, threatening to drag us both into its depths. Chapter 2: The Accumulation of Damning Evidence. The initial shock of finding my clasp near the victim was but a prelude to the onslaught of accusations that followed. The ensuing hours were a blur of questions, repeated statements, and the unnerving sensation of being regarded not as a trusted medical man, but as a suspect in a heinous crime. Holmes, bless his keen mind, had taken immediate charge, his presence at the crime scene a small beacon in the swirling fog of my distress. Yet, even his sharp inquiries and incisive observation seemed to do little against the tide of accumulating evidence. The following morning, in the austere confines of Scotland Yard, the case against me was laid bare by Inspector Lestrade. His face, usually a mask of weary determination, was now tinged with genuine regret, though his duty remained paramount. Alongside him sat Detective Inspector Gregson, whose usual smugness was replaced by a look of bewildered pity. They both knew me, respected me even, but the facts, they insisted, were too numerous, too precise, to ignore. Dr. Watson, Lestrade began, his voice flat, we have interviewed a number of individuals whose testimonies paint a singularly unfortunate picture. He gestured to a pile of neatly stacked statements on his desk. Let us begin with Mrs. Amelia Croft, a respectable widow residing in a tenement overlooking the embankment. She states, quite unequivocally, that around 8:15 yesterday evening, she observed a gentleman of your exact description, same height, similar build, a rather distinctive grey coat and bowler hat, engaged in a heated altercation with Mr. Barlow near the very spot where the body was found. She was unable to discern the words, but the gestures, she describes, were most vehement. Felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. A grey coat and bowler hat. That was precisely what I had worn. My movements that evening, as I had explained repeatedly, were dictated by my late patient call and my subsequent aimless stroll. But to whom could I turn for corroboration of a solitary walk? Gregson then chimed in, consulting his notes. And then there is Mr. Bartholomew Higgins, a dock worker who was taking a shortcut along the embankment. He reports seeing the same gentleman, carrying a medical bag, a rather old-fashioned, worn leather one, he specified, running from the scene shortly after what he described as a muffled cry. He was too far to identify the face clearly in the dim light, but the silhouette, the distinctive gait, the bag, all, he insists, matched yours, Dr. Watson. My medical bag. the very one I had carried for decades, its leather scarred from countless calls, undeniably unique. The muffled cry filled me with a sudden dread. Was that the sound I had dismissed? Lestrade cleared his throat. More compelling, perhaps, is the testimony of Mr. Thomas Finch, a street vendor who had just closed his stall nearby. He states he saw the same gentleman arguing with Barlow, and when Barlow raised his voice, the gentleman, he is quite specific, uttered a sharp, distinctive phrase. Lestrade paused, then recited, "Silence, you reprobate. You have gone too far this time." He was quite sure of the words, "Dr. Watson." I stared blankly. I would never use such language, Inspector. And certainly not in such a tone. Yet a nagging thought persisted. My voice, though not given to theatrical pronouncements, was indeed rather deep and resonant. And the phrase itself, while foreign to my usual vocabulary, possessed a certain archaic quality that, to an untrained ear, might sound like something I, a man of letters and a former military surgeon, might employ in a moment of extreme frustration. Furthermore, Gregson continued, "We have recovered fresh footprints in the soft earth near the body. The boots, Dr. Watson, correspond precisely to the size and make of your own." He held up a plaster cast, undeniably the imprint of my everyday walking boots. "And the discarded item, sir, your silver clasp, found within inches of the victim." Each piece of evidence, taken alone, might have been dismissed as coincidence. But collectively, they formed an iron cage around me. My attempts to provide a clear, unimpeachable alibi were feeble at best. I was walking home, Inspector. I remember stopping to look at the lights on the river for a moment. Then I continued on. I saw no one, spoke to no one. My patient in Wapping, Mrs. Higgins, can confirm my visit, but only up to 7:40. After that, I was alone. Lestrade sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. Dr. Watson, with all due respect, a solitary constitutional in the dark, with no witnesses, following a heated exchange with the victim, and then a hurried departure, while leaving a personal item at the scene, it simply will not suffice. Holmes, who had been sitting quietly, his eyes narrowed, absorbing every word, now leaned forward. "Lestrade, Gregson, you know Dr. Watson. You know his character. Is this truly believable?" Lestrade met Holmes's gaze, his own filled with a palpable conflict. "Mr. Holmes, I have known Dr. Watson for years. I respect him greatly. But the evidence, it is too robust. Too specific. We have 3 independent witnesses, 2 identifying his description and movements, 1 even identifying his alleged words. We have his personal effects at the scene, and matching footprints. And no satisfactory alibi for the crucial period." Gregson nodded soberly. "It pains me to say it, Mr. Holmes, but the facts point to only one conclusion." The words hung heavy in the air, a death knell to my freedom. My world, which had moments before seemed stable, now crumbled around me. I looked at Holmes, searching for a sign, a glimmer of the defiance I knew he possessed. His face, though troubled, was inscrutable. He understood the gravity of the situation as well as I did, perhaps even more acutely. "Dr. Watson," Lestrade said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic, "I am afraid I have no choice. Under the circumstances, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Mr. Reginald Barlow." A constable stepped forward, his hand hovering uncertainly. The click of the handcuffs, though imagined, echoed in my ears with chilling finality. I, Dr. John H. Watson, loyal companion to the world's greatest consulting detective, found myself accused of murder, with an impenetrable wall of evidence erected against me. My only comfort was the unwavering, if momentarily eclipsed, belief in my innocence, and the silent, burning resolve I glimpsed in Sherlock Holmes's grey eyes. For a fleeting instant, I detected a spark of bewilderment, perhaps even doubt, regarding my character in those usually unflappable eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a furious intensity, a desperate determination. He would not, I knew, abandon me to this fate. Chapter 3: Solitary Vigil and a Visit to Pentonville. The heavy gates of Pentonville clanged shut behind me with a sound of chilling finality, echoing the crushing weight that had descended upon my spirit. Stripped of my personal effects, my familiar clothes replaced by the coarse uniform of a remand prisoner, I was ushered into a small, cold cell. The reality of my situation was a raw wound. Dr. John H. Watson, a man of medicine, a loyal servant of the Crown, now incarcerated, branded a murderer. The bewildered despair that had clouded me at Scotland Yard solidified into a numb acceptance. I was innocent, yet every shred of evidence cried out against me. Back at Baker Street, the silence was, for Holmes, a deafening cacophony. The familiar rooms, once vibrant with the energy of deduction and the chatter of our shared life, now felt hollow, haunted by my absence. He moved like a spectre amongst our belongings, his long fingers trailing over my medical bag, my pipe, the worn armchair where I penned our chronicles. The reports, the testimonies, the plaster cast of my boot, the silver clasp, they lay scattered across his analysis table, each piece of evidence a dagger thrust into the heart of his judgment. He had dissected the case with a feverish intensity, running through every logical permutation, every alternative explanation. He knew me, perhaps better than anyone living. He knew my abhorrence of violence, my strict moral code, my deep-seated respect for human life. Yet, as he meticulously pieced together the prosecution's narrative, he found it terrifyingly coherent. The timeline, the descriptions, the physical evidence, it wove a tapestry of guilt so tightly knit that even his brilliant mind struggled to unravel a single thread. There was a fleeting, chilling moment when the cold logic of the facts threatened to overwhelm his faith, when the question, could Watson, in a moment of extreme passion or temporary derangement, have committed such an act? It was anathema, an unbearable thought, quickly banished by the deeper, more profound knowledge of his friend's heart. He knew me. That conviction, though momentarily shaken, remained the bedrock of his belief. The public, however, had no such intimate knowledge. The newspapers, with their insatiable appetite for scandal, had seized upon the story with gusto. "Beloved doctor turns brutal killer," shrieked one headline. "Holmes's confidant implicated in embankment murder," screamed another. My respected name was dragged through the mud, my reputation irrevocably stained. The collective outrage, fueled by sensationalism, solidified into a public clamor for swift justice. On the third day of my incarceration, the heavy door of my cell grated open, and a warder announced, "You have a visitor, Dr. Watson." My heart leaped. It could only be one man. Ushered into a small, stark room, I saw him, a Sherlock Holmes, his face a mask of weary intensity, his eyes, though, burning with an unquenchable fire. He was dressed in a dark suit, his customary deerstalker absent, lending him an air of gravitas. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, rising clumsily from the wooden bench. "This is an outrage!" He extended a hand, gripping my forearm firmly. "Indeed, Watson. An outrage of the most profound sort. Sit. Tell me everything again, from your own perspective, however inconsequential it may seem." I recounted my movements that evening once more, omitting no detail, however small. The late patient, Mrs. Higgins, whose fever had delayed me. My decision to walk, to clear my head, along the embankment. The cool air, the distant lights of the city. The vague, muffled sounds I had dismissed. My departure from the area. The walk home, lost in thought. My arrival home. My quiet evening. The constable's summons. As I spoke, Holmes observed me with an almost painful intensity. His eyes, usually analytical and detached, now seemed to search not just for facts, but for truth in my very being. He watched my gestures, noted the genuine bewilderment in my eyes, the slight tremor in my voice born of injustice, not guilt. He saw no cunning, no evasion, no telltale signs of a man concealing a monstrous secret. He saw only profound shock and the raw hurt of a man falsely accused. "I swear to you, Holmes," I finished, my voice thick with emotion, "I had no quarrel with Barlow. I barely knew the man. And to murder him? The thought is abhorrent." Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. "I believe you, Watson." The words, simple yet profound, were a balm to my tortured soul. They were not merely a statement of faith, but a declaration grounded in his unparalleled understanding of human nature, particularly mine. "But the evidence, Holmes," I countered, my voice laced with despair. "The witnesses, my clasp, the footprints, the words they claim I uttered. It's overwhelming." A flicker of something fierce ignited in his eyes. "Overwhelming, yes. But not infallible. The more perfect the illusion, Watson, the more meticulously it must have been constructed. And something constructed, no matter how artfully, can always be deconstructed." He rose, pacing the small room like a caged tiger. "The fact that it points so directly and unequivocally to you, my dear fellow, is precisely what makes it suspicious." His words, though offering little in the way of concrete hope, filled me with a fresh surge of resolve. Holmes had not abandoned me. His faith, though tested, had proven unshakable. He had looked into my heart, examined the facts as presented, and found them to be a lie. The thought that he had entertained a moment's doubt was a sting, but the knowledge that he had overcome it, that his trust in me remained intact, was a profound comfort. "I shall leave no stone unturned, Watson," he declared, turning to face me, his eyes gleaming with a renewed, almost savage, determination. Lestrade and Gregson may see only what they are presented with, but I, my dear fellow, shall look beyond the veneer of truth to the darker, more intricate mechanism beneath. Be steadfast. Your exoneration, however arduous the path, is now my singular purpose. With that, he was gone, leaving me once more to the cold solitude of my cell. But this time, a sliver of hope, tenuous yet bright, had pierced the gloom. Holmes believed me. And if Holmes believed me, then there was still a chance, however slim, that the shadow of the crimson stain could yet be lifted from my name. Chapter 4 are the first cracks in the facade. With the image of my bewildered, yet resolute, face etched in his mind, Holmes returned to Baker Street, a man possessed. The fleeting tremor of doubt that had assailed him in the initial hours had been utterly expunged, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. The sheer perfection of the case against me, its impeccable logic and overwhelming detail, now struck him not as irrefutable proof, but as the very signature of a grand deception. Such a neat package of guilt, he mused, was rarely forged by chance. He began by revisiting the scene of the crime, not with the hurried, initial survey of the first night, but with the meticulous, almost reverent attention he reserved for the most intricate of puzzles. The Embankment, usually bustling even at that late hour, was quiet. He paced the exact distance from the Thames to where Barlow's body had been found, noting the faint scent of river water and decay clinging to the air. He examined the shrubbery for any disturbed leaves or overlooked fibers, the damp earth for any marks beyond the police's documented evidence. His initial impression was confirmed: the police work had been thorough. The footprints attributed to me were indeed deeply impressed, consistent with a hurried movement. The ground where Barlow lay showed signs of a struggle, though not a prolonged one. Yet, as Holmes knelt, examining the underside of a broad dock leaf near the periphery of the disturbed area, his keen eyes detected a faint, almost invisible smudge of what appeared to be theatrical grease paint, a substance utterly out of place on the river bank, and certainly not associated with my person or profession. It was a detail so minute, so easily overlooked, that only his singular focus could have pinpointed it. A small, but significant, anomaly. Next, Holmes turned his formidable intellect to the witness testimonies. He procured copies of their full statements, poring over every word, every turn of phrase, seeking not what was said, but what was not said, what felt incongruous. Mrs. Amelia Croft, the respectable widow, had described me with almost photographic precision. The gentleman had a distinguished air, a military bearing. His coat was of a fine grey tweed, and he wore a bowler hat, slightly tipped. He held a worn leather bag. His features were clearly visible under the lamp, and his voice, though raised, was deep and resonant. Mr. Bartholomew Higgins, the dock worker, he ran past me, sir, heading east, fast. Didn't see his face clear, but the build, the way he carried himself, that doctor's bag swinging, it was him. No mistake. And his boots, they splashed right through a puddle, you see. Mr. Thomas Finch, the street vendor, was the most damaging, with his recollection of the precise phrase, "Silence, you reprobate. You have gone too far this time." Holmes reread Finch's statement several times, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Silence, you reprobate." The words themselves were curiously archaic, almost theatrical. He knew my speech, my turns of phrase, my occasional use of a well-placed Latin tag or a colorful metaphor derived from my medical background. But reprobate? And in such an oratorical style? It rang false. I was a man of action, and when provoked, my anger was expressed more directly, less performatively. He decided to re-interview Finch first, approaching him not as a detective, but as a casual inquirer interested in the local color of the embankment. Finch, pleased by the attention, repeated his tale. "Are you quite certain of the exact wording, my good man?" Holmes inquired, producing a sovereign from his waistcoat pocket. "It is important that every detail is precise." Finch's eyes gleamed at the coin. "Oh, quite certain, sir. Every blessed word. Stuck in my head, it did." "Silence, you reprobate." He puffed out his chest, mimicking the gesture he claimed to have seen, a broad, almost melodramatic sweep of the arm. Holmes's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. That gesture. It felt rehearsed, too grand for a spontaneous outburst, particularly from a man of my reserved temperament. It was an embellishment, perhaps, or a memory distorted by the shock of the event. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a detail intended to be remembered, a flourish designed to mimic a certain kind of distinguished anger? A second, more subtle inconsistency emerged from Mrs. Croft's testimony. She had described my features as clearly visible under the lamp. Yet, the lamp in question was some distance away, and the light, Holmes knew, was often diffuse and deceiving on a misty London night. Could it have been too clear? Was the witness unconsciously filling in details based on a preconceived notion, perhaps aided by suggestion? Or was there another explanation for the clarity? While these anomalies were mere whispers against the roaring storm of evidence, they were enough for Holmes. They suggested a careful construction, a deliberate artistry rather than the haphazard cruelty of a spontaneous crime. The grease paint, the peculiar formality of the outburst, the overly precise description, they began to weave a disturbing pattern of impersonation. He pondered the victim, Reginald Barlow. A man of unsavory reputation, yes. But his murder, if it were truly an act of revenge or passion from an ordinary adversary, would likely have been a simpler affair. Why this elaborate framing of an innocent man, and specifically, of me? It seemed a needless complication, unless the true target was not Barlow, but rather the individual whom Barlow's murder would implicate. The thought, once conceived, grew cold and clear in his mind. This was not merely a murder, it was a complex trap, a meticulously orchestrated act of malice. The sheer audacity of it, the intricate planning required to mimic my appearance, my voice, my very mannerisms, and to plant evidence so perfectly, hinted at a mind of exceptional, albeit diabolical, caliber. A mind, Holmes realized with a chilling certainty, that held a profound and personal grievance against him. For who else would possess the motive and the skill to strike at him through the man he trusted most? The seeds of a far more sinister plot, one designed for the detective rather than the doctor, were now firmly planted in his analytical brain. Chapter 5: The Shadow Player's Hand. The faint smudge of theatrical grease paint on the dock leaf had been the first whisper, the peculiar phrasing of silence, "You reprobate," the second. Now, Holmes pursued the impersonation theory with the relentless logic of a bloodhound on a scent. He knew that to dismantle such a perfect illusion, he must expose the minute imperfections, the almost imperceptible flaws that betray a copy. His initial re-interview with Mr. Finch had yielded an intriguing, if subtle, clue. The street vendor's broad, almost theatrical gesture when mimicking the supposed Dr. Watson had lodged itself in Holmes's mind. It was a gesture of exasperated authority, perhaps, but one that felt strangely performed. I, Watson, was a man of reserved demeanor, my emotions often contained, even in moments of anger. A forceful word, yes, a dramatic sweep of the arm, no. Holmes next sought out the other witnesses again, but this time with a different approach. He did not overtly question their testimony, instead, he engaged them in seemingly innocuous conversation, subtly guiding them to elaborate on the more sensory aspects of their observations. To Mrs. Croft, he inquired about the quality of the light, the texture of the gentleman's coat. Was the wool coarse or fine, Mrs. Croft? Did it hang naturally, or did it seem stiff, perhaps? The widow pondered for a moment. Well, now that you mention it, Mr. Holmes, it was a fine tweed, yes, but it seemed to hold its shape almost too well. And the hat, it sat rather low, obscuring the upper part of the face, though I did see his nose quite distinctly. Holmes filed away this observation, a hat pulled low, a coat that held an unnatural stiffness, both consistent with an attempt to alter or conceal identity. But it was the voice that proved to be the most compelling crack in the facade. Mr. Finch had been adamant about the exact phrase. Holmes, recalling my own voice with perfect fidelity, the subtle rasp from a forgotten throat injury, the particular cadence of my accent, the way certain consonants were softened, knew that while the pitch and resonance might have been imitated, the underlying timbre, the very soul of a voice, was almost impossible to perfectly replicate. He consulted with a retired music hall impresario, a man known for his expertise in mimicry and vocal performance. To imitate a man's voice perfectly, Mr. Holmes, the impresario had said, stroking his impressive walrus moustache, is a feat even for the most gifted. One can achieve a resemblance, yes, the general pitch and rhythm. But the subtle inflections, the unconscious habits, the very essence of the vocal cords, that requires a true genius of deception, or a lifetime of study. It is easier, far easier, to simply sound like the type of person, rather than the specific individual. This conversation crystallized Holmes's suspicion. The Watson described by Finch had not been me, but rather a cleverly constructed idea of me, a caricature built from easily observable traits. The deep, resonant voice, the military bearing, the distinguished air, these were the outward trappings, not the true man. The mimic had likely focused on projecting a certain archetype rather than absolute replication, knowing that the average observer would connect the dots to my well-known public persona. Holmes then delved deeper into the description of the Watson figure's walk. Mr. Higgins had spoken of a distinctive gait. Holmes knew my walk intimately, a slight, almost imperceptible stiffness in my right leg from my old wound, a certain forward lean. He recalled observing myself in the reflection of shop windows, noticing the details of my own posture. He returned to the area where Higgins had seen the fleeing figure and began to walk, mimicking various gaits, including his own and his impression of mine. He realized that a stiff, slightly rolling gait could be imitated, but the unconscious micro-adjustments, the subtle shift in weight I made due to the lingering effects of my Afghan injury, would be devilishly difficult for an impersonator to maintain under stress, especially while running. The more Holmes contemplated the sheer complexity of this deception, the more a chilling recognition began to take root. This was not the clumsy work of an opportunist. This was the meticulous, theatrical precision of a mind that reveled in elaborate schemes, a mind that understood human perception and how to twist it. The deliberate planting of the clasp, the overly clear facial recognition in dim light, the almost too perfect descriptions from witnesses, these were the hallmarks of a psychological manipulator, a puppeteer pulling strings in the shadows. He recalled cases from his past, instances where the criminal mind had not merely sought profit or power, but had delighted in the intellectual struggle, in the crafting of a perfect illusion, or in the infliction of a personal, psychological wound. The names of such adversaries were few, but their impact on Holmes had been profound. One name, in particular, began to echo in the chambers of his memory, a name he had hoped to never utter again. This wasn't merely a framing, it was a performance. And the audience, Holmes now understood with a cold certainty, was not the jury, nor the public, but himself. The target was not Watson's life, but Holmes's intellect, his reputation, and his deepest bonds. Only one man he had ever encountered possessed the intellectual vanity and the depth of vengeful malice to conceive and execute such a fiendish plot. A master criminal, believed to be neutralized, perhaps even dead, who had now resurfaced to inflict the ultimate torment upon his greatest adversary, to make Holmes question his own judgment, his own trust, and to witness the downfall of his dearest friend by his own unwitting hand. The architect of ruin, a shadow player of the highest order, was making his move. Chapter 6: The Architect of Ruin Revealed. The realization, once it struck Holmes, hit with the force of a physical blow. The intricate stagecraft, the meticulous details of the impersonation, the psychological torment inherent in framing his closest companion, these were not the crude workings of a common criminal. This was the work of a mind that not only possessed genius but reveled in its deployment, a mind whose malice was as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. He paced the length of 221B, Baker Street, oblivious to the piles of papers, the bubbling retort, or the mournful London fog pressing against the windows. His fingers, usually so deft, trembled slightly as he recalled other adversaries, other intricate puzzles. But none had ever sought to wound him so deeply, to strike at the very heart of his personal world. The phrase "silence, you reprobate," echoed in his mind, then the remembered gesture, the unnatural stiffness of the coat, the overly distinctive gait. It was all a performance, calibrated to perfection, designed not just to fool the police, but to torment him. It was a challenge, a declaration of war, etched in the suffering of his friend. Then, with a jolt that sent a tremor through his lean frame, a name surfaced from the depths of his memory. A name he had hoped to consign to the annals of history, a nemesis whose shadow he believed he had finally outrun. Professor Marius Thorne. Thorne. a man whose public persona was one of academic brilliance, a renowned philologist and logician, whose lectures at the university were celebrated for their incisive wit and intellectual rigor. But beneath that veneer of scholarly respectability lay a mind of unparalleled deviousness, a calculating strategist who viewed human society as a grand chessboard upon which he moved his pawns with chilling detachment. Holmes had crossed paths with Thorne but once, several years prior, in a labyrinthine case involving international espionage and the theft of priceless government ciphers. It had been a battle of wits that had stretched Holmes's faculties to their absolute limit, ending with Thorne's intricate network dismantled, his reputation tarnished, and his clandestine activities exposed, though without concrete proof that would send him to the gallows. Thorne had slipped through Holmes's fingers, vanishing into the continent, his public career ruined, his academic standing destroyed. At the time, Holmes had considered it a victory, albeit a qualified one. He now understood it was merely a temporary reprieve. Thorne's signature was precisely this, an almost artistic approach to crime, elevating it to a dark intellectual pursuit. He despised brute force, preferring to manipulate minds, to weave intricate deceptions that implicated others, leaving no direct trace of his own involvement. His vanity demanded a display of intellectual superiority, and his revenge, Holmes now understood, would be equally cerebral. The motive was clear: vengeance. Not merely for the exposure of his criminal enterprise, but for the profound humiliation Holmes had inflicted upon his intellectual pride. Thorne had seen his entire carefully constructed life crumble, his genius undermined by a mere consulting detective. And what better way to wound Holmes than to use his most cherished relationships, his dearest ally, as the instrument of his downfall? Reginald Barlow, the victim, was merely a component in Thorne's grand design. Holmes quickly pieced together the connection. Barlow, with his dubious shipping ventures, had recently attempted to expand into certain markets that Thorne, even in his diminished state, still controlled or sought to influence. Perhaps Barlow had unwittingly stumbled upon some remnant of Thorne's network, or perhaps Thorne had simply chosen him as a convenient, unsavory target whose demise would attract police attention and provide the necessary stage for his malicious drama. Barlow was a means to an end, a puppet whose strings were cut to initiate the framing of Watson. Thorne knew Holmes would scrutinize every detail, every witness statement. He knew that the very robustness of the evidence against Watson would eventually trigger Holmes's suspicion. This was not about simple murder, it was about psychological warfare. It was designed to force Holmes to battle his own trust, to cast a shadow of doubt over his most fundamental beliefs. The ultimate triumph for Thorne would be to see Holmes publicly fail, to watch his intellect buckle under the weight of an irrefutable, yet false, narrative, and to see me, his loyal Boswell, condemned. The master criminal, Professor Marius Thorne, had returned. And his vengeful shadow had fallen squarely upon our small haven at Baker Street, threatening to consume us both. The game, Holmes realized, was now far more personal, and infinitely more dangerous, than any he had ever played. Perhaps Barlow had unwittingly stumbled upon some remnant of Thorne's network, or perhaps Thorne had simply chosen him as a convenient, unsavory target whose demise would attract police attention and provide the necessary stage for his malicious drama. Barlow was a means to an end, a puppet whose strings were cut to initiate the framing of Watson. Thorne knew Holmes would scrutinize every detail, every witness statement. He knew that the very robustness of the evidence against Watson would eventually trigger Holmes's suspicion. This was not about simple murder, it was about psychological warfare. It was designed to force Holmes to battle his own trust, to cast a shadow of doubt over his most fundamental beliefs. The ultimate triumph for Thorne would be to see Holmes publicly fail, to watch his intellect buckle under the weight of an irrefutable, yet false, narrative, and to see me, his loyal Boswell, condemned. The master criminal, Professor Marius Thorne, had returned. And his vengeful shadow had fallen squarely upon our small haven at Baker Street, threatening to consume us both. The game, Holmes realized, was now far more personal, and infinitely more dangerous, than any he had ever played. Chapter 7: The Trap is Sprung. The air in the Old Bailey observation gallery was thick with a nervous tension, a palpable current that crackled around Holmes. Dressed in the nondescript garb of a clerk, his gaze, however, was anything but ordinary. It was a finely honed instrument, sweeping the diverse faces below, searching for a specific signature in the human crowd. Lestrade, disguised as a rather disgruntled solicitor, occasionally brushed past, offering terse, coded updates. The rumor, skillfully planted, had done its work. The public vestibule below teemed with curious onlookers, sensation seekers, and journalists, all hoping for a glimpse of the new evidence that would seal Dr. Watson's fate. Hours crawled by, each minute a fresh agony of anticipation. Holmes, however, remained outwardly impassive, a statue of patient vigilance. He knew Thorne's vanity, his need to witness the unfolding drama he had orchestrated. He would come. Then, a subtle shift in the crowd's eddy caught Holmes's eye. A figure detached himself from the general throng, moving with a deliberate, almost academic stride. He wore a modest tweed suit, spectacles that slightly distorted the bridge of his nose, and a precisely trimmed beard that lent him an air of austere intellect. His eyes, though shielded by the glass, darted with an unnerving intensity, assessing, calculating. He carried no briefcase, no hat, merely a folded newspaper clutched in one hand. It was Thorne. Older, perhaps a touch more gaunt than Holmes remembered, but unmistakably the professor. There was an almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips, a flicker of intellectual arrogance as he surveyed the scene, clearly relishing the chaos he had wrought. He moved towards a shadowed alcove, a vantage point from which he could observe the entrance to the courtroom, the supposed location of the new evidence, without being unduly conspicuous. Holmes allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible nod to Lestrade, who had also spotted the figure. The signal was subtle, a mere tightening of the jaw, but Lestrade understood. The hunt was on. Thorne, settling into his chosen position, unfolded his newspaper, but his eyes were not on the print. They were fixed on the entrance, eager to discern the nature of this mysterious new development. He was clearly trying to gauge if his perfect artifice had been compromised, if any loose thread of his design threatened to unravel. As Thorne remained engrossed, a figure emerged from a side door, a burly police sergeant, seemingly quite agitated, carrying a small, leather-bound book. He made a show of conferring loudly with a barrister near the entrance, ensuring his words carried to those within earshot, including Thorne. "A diary, sir," the sergeant boomed, holding up the book for a moment before concealing it under his arm. Found hidden in the victim's lodgings. Contains entries detailing a secret liaison and a particularly damning accusation scribbled just hours before his death. This will put the noose around Watson's neck for sure. The barrister played his part, recoiling in feigned shock. A diary? With a fresh accusation? Good heavens, man! This changes everything. The poor doctor won't stand a chance now. A ripple of excited whispers ran through the crowd. Thorne, however, did not whisper. Holmes saw the almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw, the flicker of confusion in his eyes. A diary? A secret liaison? An accusation scrawled just hours before death. This was not part of his plan. His plan had been precise, controlled. An unpredictable element, a detail that threatened to expose an unforeseen connection, an avenue of inquiry that had nothing to do with the meticulous framing of Watson, was anathema to his orderly mind. Thorne's confidence began to waver, replaced by a growing unease. He needed to know what this diary contained. His artistic masterpiece could not tolerate such a crude, unexpected brushstroke. He moved, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, trying to get closer, to glean more information. As he shifted, ostensibly to gain a better view, he passed by Lestrade, who had positioned himself discreetly. Without a word, Lestrade executed a move he had practiced tirelessly. A quick, almost casual turn, and his hand, like a viper, shot out, seizing Thorne's arm in an iron grip. "Professor Thorne, I believe." Lestrade's voice was deceptively mild, but his grip was unyielding. Thorne stiffened, his eyes narrowing, the previous unease hardening into a mask of cold fury. "I believe you are mistaken, Inspector. I am merely a concerned citizen, observing the proceedings." "Indeed," Holmes said, stepping out of the shadows, his disguise shed, his voice cutting and clear. "A citizen with a rather peculiar interest in the downfall of Dr. Watson, would you not agree, Professor? And a man who, if my deductions are correct, possesses a singular talent for manipulating the very fabric of truth." Thorne's eyes, momentarily, met Holmes's. For a fleeting instant, the mask slipped, revealing a flash of incandescent hatred and grudging admiration. He knew he was caught. The game, his perfect, cruel game, had been exposed. The new evidence was a ruse, a bait precisely calculated to appeal to his intellectual vanity and his need for absolute control. A clever gambit, Mr. Holmes, Thorne conceded, his voice a low hiss, devoid of emotion. "You lay a trap, not for the obvious, but for the unseen flaw." "My compliments." "But you have no proof." "Oh, but I do, Professor," Holmes replied, a predatory gleam in his eyes. The theatrical grease paint found near the scene, a substance often used in amateur dramatics. The overly precise testimonies of witnesses who saw what they were meant to see. And a certain pattern of vengeful orchestration that bears your unmistakable signature. The diary, you see, was merely a diversion. The real crime, Professor, was your attempt to destroy a good man's life, and in doing so, wound my own. Before Thorne could react, before he could attempt another of his cunning evasions, a squad of plainclothes officers, who had been strategically placed throughout the vestibule, converged. With calm efficiency, they surrounded him. Thorne offered no resistance, his eyes still fixed on Holmes, a silent acknowledgement of defeat, and a promise of future retribution. The trap was sprung. The shadow player, the architect of my ruin, was finally unmasked. And though the battle was won, Holmes knew, the war with such a formidable intellect was far from over. Chapter 8: Exoneration and Reflection. The hours that followed Thorne's apprehension were a whirlwind of activity, a frantic undoing of the meticulously woven web of deceit. Under the relentless interrogation of Holmes, and the increasingly astounded Lestrade, Professor Marius Thorne, despite his initial defiance, gradually revealed the chilling intricacies of his plot. His narrative, delivered with a detached, almost academic precision, detailed how he had stalked me for weeks, observing my habits, my distinctive gait, the precise details of my attire, even my vocal inflections. He had employed a network of down-and-out actors and impressionists, honed in the darker corners of London's less reputable stages, to embody my persona. The witnesses, Mrs. Croft, Mr. Higgins, Mr. Finch, were not entirely fabrications. They were real individuals, but their perceptions had been expertly manipulated. Thorne had arranged for one of his skilled associates, disguised as myself, to deliberately engage Barlow in a loud, staged argument within their sightlines. The impersonator had been trained to mimic my exact coat, my unique medical bag, my particular way of walking, and even the precise silence, "You reprobate," phrase, delivered in a voice carefully pitched to resemble mine. My lost silver clasp, a serendipitous discovery for Thorne, had been a final, perfectly planted piece of corroborative evidence. He had even ensured that my boot print was left near the scene, perhaps by using a mold or by having his operative step precisely in my earlier footsteps, carefully preserving the impression for later discovery. Barlow's murder, Thorne admitted with chilling indifference, was merely a component. The man had indeed crossed Thorne's path in some unsavory business dealings, making him a convenient, expendable target. His death provided the necessary backdrop for my framing, the canvas upon which Thorne painted his masterpiece of revenge against Holmes. Lestrade, initially skeptical, grew increasingly pale as the sheer audacity and malevolence of the plot became clear. He had seen many crimes, but rarely one so psychologically intricate, so personally vindictive. The evidence, once seemingly robust against me, now dissolved into a series of clever illusions, each one exposed by Holmes's piercing logic. The police, embarrassed by their prior convictions, moved with haste to correct their error. The iron gates of Pentonville clanged open for me again, this time with a welcome, liberating sound. The autumn sunlight, though weak, felt like a caress on my skin after the dim confines of my cell. Holmes was there, of course, his tall, lean figure a beacon of steadfastness against the formidable prison architecture. He offered no dramatic embrace, no effusive words, merely a firm handshake and a look that spoke volumes of relief and quiet satisfaction. "Watson," he said, his voice calmer than I had heard it in days, "it appears the chains of injustice have been lifted." My own relief was so profound it left me momentarily speechless. "Holmes," I finally managed, I owe you my life, and my name." "Nonsense, old friend," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "You owe me nothing but the companionship I value above all else. Besides, I found the case intellectually stimulating, if personally distressing." His eyes, however, betrayed the depth of the distress. Back at 221B, Baker Street, the familiar clutter of our rooms, the scent of tobacco and chemicals, the comfortable worn armchair, it all felt like a homecoming from a harrowing journey. I sat down, a mug of hot tea warming my hands, still processing the bewildering ordeal. "Tell me, Holmes," I ventured, after a long silence, that initial moment when Lestrade presented the evidence against me. Did you ever doubt?" Holmes looked into the dancing flames of the fireplace, his expression pensive. "For a fleeting instant, Watson," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The evidence was so robust, so perfectly aligned. The logical mind, unclouded by sentiment, could construct a terrifyingly plausible narrative of your guilt. It was the purest form of intellectual torment for me. To see the facts align against you, yet to know, with a certainty deeper than logic, that it was impossible." He turned, his gaze meeting mine, unwavering. But it was precisely that impossibility, that fundamental contradiction between the evidence and the man I know, which became the first thread I pulled. The very perfection of the deception was its undoing. He rose, walking to the window, staring out at the familiar London street. "Thorne understood the mechanics of the mind, Watson. He knew that to cause me the greatest anguish, he must strike at my reason, force me to choose between undeniable facts and an unbreakable trust. He sought to make me doubt not just your innocence, but my own judgment, my own perception of human character. And you did not," I stated, a warmth spreading through me, stronger than the tea. "No," Holmes affirmed, turning from the window, a rare, almost tender expression on his face. "For while facts are paramount, there are deeper truths, truths of character and loyalty, that transcend mere evidence. You, my dear Watson, are one such truth." The ordeal had been a crucible, testing the very foundations of our extraordinary partnership. It had shown me the unwavering loyalty of my friend, and it had reminded Holmes that even the most brilliant analytical mind must sometimes yield to the profound, irreducible certainty of the heart. The bond between us, forged in the fires of countless adventures, had been strained to its breaking point, only to emerge stronger, more profound than ever before. London, with its shadows and its mysteries, still awaited, but I knew, with a renewed and absolute conviction, that with Holmes at my side, no darkness could truly overcome us.